Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Thank you for joining us here on CPAC as we bring you special coverage tonight of the U.S. election, in particular the high-stakes presidential race between the Democratic nominee Kamala Harris and the Republican nominee Donald Trump. With that, let's take a look right now at Howard University. This is in Washington, D.C., and as you can see, hundreds, perhaps thousands of people gathered right now at the historically black university, the alma mater of the Vice President Kamala Harris, and also where we are told by the Democratic campaign, where we will hear from Kamala Harris a little later this evening. And this is not the only location we are watching closely for you this evening. Also watching very closely Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida. Of course, the property owned by Donald Trump, often referred to tongue-in-cheek as the Southern White House during his first term in office. Also keeping an eye right now at Palm Beach Convention Center, and that's because from the Republican campaign, we've not really been given clarity as to where we will hear from Donald Trump this evening. Perhaps it will be at Mar-a-Lago, perhaps it will be at the Palm Beach Convention Center. Either way, we will have full coverage for you here tonight on CPAC, and in an hour's time we will join our friends at C-SPAN for their special coverage of tonight's vote. But ahead of that, we did want to take a uniquely Canadian look at what's happening south of the border as we switch our gaze right now to the U.S. White House. The United States, of course, of great consequence to this country, our closest neighbor and ally, our largest trading partner. So what happens in the U.S. will have powerful ripple effects right here in Canada. And with that, let's bring in our first guest this evening, the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen, who joins us tonight from the Metropolitan Brasserie and Restaurant in downtown Ottawa. This is where Politico is hosting their own special watch party, which explains all the noise behind you, Ambassador. Regardless, very happy to have you on the program this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Well, Michael, thanks very much, and thanks to CPAC for its wall-to-wall coverage.
Wall-to-wall, which is what we will bring our viewers this evening. You know, as we wait for the results to come in, Ambassador, one thing is very clear. Americans are divided almost equally on their priorities, be it economic or social policy, divided on who they want to see lead them as president. And, you know, really this has been a pattern since the 2000 campaign. So I want to begin here with talking about how worried Canadians should be about a United States that may be politically volatile.
So I think there's a difference between a country that is divided and a country that is politically volatile. I think one of the hallmarks of the United States has been that it is capable of being divided, of having half the population on one side of a question, half the population on another side of the question, but still fundamentally together. And that's the nature of democracy and the way democracy functions in its purest sense. So I've been an advocate that Canada does not need to worry about its relationship with the United States. It is enormous. It is significant. I think it's going to be significant and durable and lasting, regardless of the outcome of this presidential election. I remind people that unlike Canada, there are actually hundreds of elections taking place in the United States today. And you know, they're just at the federal level. 34 senators will be elected, 435 members of the House of Representatives, and the President of the United States. And it's that collection of elections that provide the stability to the United States government and that prevents there from being herky-jerky changes in position as a result of any one particular election.
You use the word stability, and you know, regardless of when we hear the final results, we could be in this waiting period before a winner is actually declared. And with January 6th in mind, I think many Canadians do worry about the rise of political violence in the United States. Do you think that's now a hallmark of American campaigns?
So I don't think one day in a 248-year history of the country stands for a hallmark. That said, you know, I've learned a long time ago, you don't want to play around and play games with potential violence and unrest. But this is not going to be the first close election in the history of the United States. There are a whole series of very close elections. Consider the election in 2000 between George Bush and Al Gore. That was an election that wasn't called for 5 weeks. And there wasn't unrest, there wasn't violence, the country didn't fall apart, democracy didn't fall apart, democracy worked. It resolved the differences, it resolved the issues, resolved the legal challenges, and the country came out a clear democracy again, stronger arguably than it was beforehand.
Now, whoever is elected president will preside over a review of CUSMA, the trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. You know, do Canadians need to be worried about rising protectionism in the U.S.? Because we have heard Donald Trump talk about tariffs. We know that Kamala Harris did not vote for CUSMA the first time around as senator. Is trade going to be an issue for Canadians, whoever wins this election?
So I think the answer to that is yes and no. I think trade is a big issue. I don't think protectionism is as big an issue as a lot of Canadians would like to make it be. I'll give you the headline, the bottom line. Today, the United States and Canada enjoy a trade relationship that is unrivaled in the world. There is $3.4 billion a day in trade, Canadian dollars a day in trade that crosses our border, generating or sustaining millions of jobs on both sides of the border. Most of that trade is free trade. And I haven't heard any candidate say that they want to get rid of $3.4 billion a day in trade and chuck it overboard. It's too important to the United States. It's too important to Canada. It's too important to sustaining a large volume of jobs in both countries, which is why I think that there's going to be a robust and healthy and prosperous trade relationship between Canada and the United States, regardless of the outcome of this election.
Well, I'm sure many Canadians will take comfort at those words, Ambassador. I do want to thank you again for joining us and kicking off our coverage this evening. I know you have a watch party of your own to join, so have fun there down at the Metropolitan Brasserie. Thank you for this evening.
Well, we're sorry to miss you down here, Michael, but thanks very much for having me on your air.
Anytime, Ambassador. Thank you. Well, with that, let's bring in Éric Grenier now. You see him right there, polls analyst and the man behind the writ. Éric, good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Now, listen, you and I are going to have a few times in this hour to talk about what we're seeing already in terms of early results in the U.S. But I think it's worthwhile to set up what we're actually going to watch for big picture tonight, because when we think about an overview, we've been told that it's going to be a handful of battleground states where this election will be determined. Walk us through the big picture here, Éric. What are you watching out for?
Yeah, there really are just 7 states that I think we're going to be watching throughout the night and maybe into the early morning as well. The polls at the end of the campaign were suggesting that things were neck and neck between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, 50-50 more or less in the polls nationwide. And in the 7 swing states, pretty much also 50-50 across the board. So the ones that we're talking about are the 2 in the Southwest, so Nevada and Arizona, 2 in the Southeast, so North Carolina and Georgia, and 3 in the Midwest, or the Sun Belt, or the Rust Belt, I should say, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The polls did suggest that Trump might have the advantage in the states in the Southeast and in the Southwest, and that Kamala Harris was probably doing better in the Midwest. Pennsylvania does seem to be the keystone state very much in terms of this election. It was the one that is the closest in terms of the polls. And generally, when you're working out the Electoral College math, whoever does win Pennsylvania does have the much, much, much better chance of winning the election. If it doesn't go one way or the other for one of the candidates, they do have some other options based on what happens in the other states. But these are the 7 that are almost certainly going to decide who becomes the next president.
Yeah, and when we talk about Pennsylvania, I've heard it time and again that is the easiest path for Kamala Harris in particular to get Pennsylvania to secure the traditional blue wall, and that would get her closer to 270. Again, clearer path. But we are getting some early numbers, and I know you wanted to point out Georgia in particular in our first conversation. What are you seeing there right now that you want to focus in on?
Yeah, Georgia is the state of those 7 where we've seen the most votes counted so far. Now, the early vote that we've seen that has been counted does have Trump ahead of Kamala Harris by a decent margin, but we're waiting for a lot of these votes to come in, especially around the Atlanta area where we haven't seen that many being counted. Some of the counties don't have any votes counted just yet. That is really where it is going to be decided, whether the Democrats get a lot of that vote in Atlanta. What we've seen so far does suggest that we're looking towards a race that is almost as tight as in 2020, but that will be, I think, where it's going to come down. And we're going to be watching to see more of those votes come in the Atlanta region. And if it does go as strongly for Kamala Harris as it went for Joe Biden in 2020, then the Democrats might be able to win Georgia. And if they do, then it takes some pressure off of the Democrats to try to sweep all of the Midwest.
Okay, well, we are watching and very happy again to have you on the program. Eric will speak again a little later. That is polls analyst Éric Grenier. Well, let's now get the view from the American Capitol right now, and welcome to the program Linda Feldmann. She is the Washington Bureau Chief for the Christian Science Monitor, and veteran Washington journalist David Levinthal also joins us. Hello to both of you. Nice to have the gang back together.
Yeah, hi, Michael. Good to see you.
And you, Linda. Listen, you know, the polls have both campaigns at a statistical tie. And as we heard from Eric, you know, it's going to boil down to these 7 states where when we look at the polling numbers over these last couple of months, they've been within the margin of error. So I'm wondering what each of you is hearing right now from Democrats, from Republicans. How are they feeling this evening? Linda, I'll get you to start us off.
So everybody is talking positively. I mean, this is, you know, with the final moments before the polls close, everybody's trying to squeeze out every last vote. My Republican friends say that that the turnout operation for the Republicans is better than people had said. Kamala Harris, I think, has a better turnout operation. But both parties, both sides are highly motivated. It's a combination of fear and excitement. And honestly, I've been getting texts from friends all day. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I honestly don't know. Yeah,
a toss-up, as they say. David, what are you hearing from Democrats, from Republicans about how they're feeling at this all-important moment?
Much of the same, but I would add one state to the mix here that if we were having this conversation 3 months ago, Michael, it would have been preposterous to mention, but the state of Iowa. You might even want to call that an 8th swing state. There was a late-breaking poll that came out from the Des Moines Register, the largest newspaper in that state, and it indicated that Kamala Harris was actually up a couple of percentage points over Donald Trump. So that's kind of an interesting wrinkle. The polls will be closing there very soon. And keep an eye on what's happening there, because if Kamala Harris wins those 6 electoral votes, talk about taking pressure off of her, she could lose a state such as Nevada. And yet, if she picked up Iowa in that scenario, it would be a wash. So it's going to be a long night. And I don't think we are going to know anything about who is the next president of the United States until well into this week.
Yeah, you know what? I'm glad you raised Iowa, because it does touch upon my next couple of questions to both of you. Because a week ago, you know, give or take, we heard the closing arguments from both campaigns. And I'm wondering how those appeals and what came out of that final argument might affect or is affecting what we are seeing tonight. Linda?
The closing arguments were interesting. It was for Kamala Harris, it was a combination of here's what I'm going to do for you. I am you. I am the middle class, and I'm going to help lift people up. It was also a lot of fear mongering about Donald Trump. So in some ways, this election is a referendum on Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump really only talks about himself. You get a little bit of fear mongering about Kamala Harris, but you know, there's the anxiety is very high, and frankly, both sides have been ramping that up.
Mm-hmm. David?
Yeah, this has been an election about anxiety, but it's also one, too, that has been extraordinary in all of the different things that have led us to this point. I mean, let's remember that Donald Trump has been convicted of 34 felonies back in May, and then that a colossally awful debate for Joe Biden that in June that led to him dropping out of the race in July and Kamala Harris getting in. There were not 1 but 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump's life. So, I mean, anxiety has been baked into this process from the get-go. So it's not surprising at all that that has been such a motivating factor, that has been such a factor in the closing arguments for both candidates, and that the whole public here in the United States is kind of freaking itself out all the way to the ballot box in order to cast their ballots.
Mm-hmm. But, you know, when you talk about Iowa, David, I'm kind of wondering if what we heard, for example, at Madison Square Gardens might have had an effect on that, because in addition to the closing arguments, and again, what was said at Madison Square Garden in particular for the last closing argument for Donald Trump, we also saw or are seeing this huge gender divide where women are saying they are far more likely to vote for Kamala Harris and men more likely, perhaps less so, but more likely to vote for Donald Trump. What do you make of that kind of trend line, David?
If Kamala Harris was to win Iowa, and mind you, it's still odds on that Donald Trump will win Iowa, but let's just say for the sake of argument that Kamala Harris wins Iowa, it will be because of women. Absolutely, 100%. And we can see from the polling, we can see from on-the-ground reporting, extemporaneous reporting, that women in particular seem to be well above where, voting rate-wise, where they were in 2020, and that is going to play into Kamala Harris's favor one way or another. Will it be enough to ultimately allow her to beat Donald Trump is really the question at this point.
Linda, what do you make of that gender breakdown and how it might affect what we're going to be seeing once the results come in?
Right. The gender gap in this race is massive. It's 34 points. If you add up the women's vote over men for Kamala Harris and then the reverse for Trump, Trump is running in part on hyper-masculinity. You know, he's got Hulk Hogan and all these tough guys, Dana White, endorsing him, campaigning for him. Joe Rogan just endorsed him. The big issue on the ballot that is driving some of this is abortion. This is the first presidential election since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. No more nationwide right to abortion. And there's a lot of fear among people who support abortion rights that a Trump presidency could usher in a federal ban on abortion. So this is a huge driver. I will note also that in the early vote in states that mark gender on their early votes, there's been a big gender gap there. 55% women versus 45% men voting early. We can't assume that it's all women who are pro-choice, but I think it's a safe bet that a lot of them are. So
here we are, a tight race going in. We are starting to see some results. Care to make any predictions, either one of you at this point, be it the final result or any kind of trend line tonight, Linda?
I change my mind every day. I was thinking that Trump had it, and then in the last few days, I'm beginning to think Kamala Harris might pull this off. But I agree with the ambassador who said that no matter what happens, we Americans, we can handle this. I don't think we're going to dissolve into civil war, or that this country's going to explode if either way. Okay,
Dave, any predictions from you?
Double down on what I said a little bit earlier, that I don't think we're going to know the ultimate result until well into the week. Just remember that the Associated Press took until the Saturday after the Tuesday election day in 2020 to call the race. Decision Desk HQ, another outfit, called it on the Friday. So even under that scenario, it was several days forward, and we'd likely have an even closer race this time around in 2024.
Okay, well, luckily you, me, Linda, we're going to speak again a little later this hour. We're also going to speak tomorrow, but for now, thank you to the two of you. Nice to have the old gang back together.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
And that is Linda Feldmann and David Levinthal. Now, like the whole country, as we heard from Ambassador Cohen, Quebec also relies heavily on the United States as an export market. In fact, 73% of the province's exports go to the U.S., which is why the province's Delegate General in New York is probably watching tonight's election very closely. CPAC's Catherine Lafrance spoke to David Brulotte earlier today.
Alors, Monsieur Brulotte, bonsoir.
Good evening, Mr. Brulotte.
Bonsoir. Il est beaucoup question de protectionnisme
dans cette élection. There's a lot of talk about protectionism in this election in both the Democratic and Republican camps. What effect is this likely to have on Quebec in particular? Well, we're all very aware of what the two candidates have been saying. We have set up a number of action committees here in the United States to follow the pronouncements of both candidates. And as you said, it isn't one of the parties only. There's protective measures being put forward by both candidates and their parties. And there has been as well in the past. So, of course, we follow that very, very closely. So, just how much trade is there between Quebec and the various states each year? Is Quebec a small player on this chessboard? Well, on the world stage, number-wise, we're a smaller player than a lot of other nations, but what's important to remember, and that we remind our American partners daily, is that we're a safe and partner, a first-choice partner, and our exchanges these last 5 years have increased by more than 30%. That's more than 7% per year increase. The United States, of course, is the first of our partners for export, and it's also the case for many states. New York State and Middle Atlantic in particular are part of my territory as the Quebec delegate in New York. And that's the main area where Quebec exports are headed, and it's also increasing very much there, in particular in some neuralgic sectors for Quebec. So what the sectors that should be the most fearful about the results of the elections? A little bit difficult to tell right now. We'll have to wait to see what the Americans, who they will have chosen, which candidate they will have elected, both in the White House as well as in Congress. The announcements have been made for various measures, for example, reinforcing programs that are favorable to the United States or other protectionist measures that can affect quite a number of sectors. So we're being very careful about what will be put forward in the weeks and months ahead by both parties. You said that there are several states that are partners with Quebec, and that Quebec has several offices, particularly yours in New York. So outside of these trade work, what else do the Quebec delegate do? Well, I wouldn't call it lobbying, but rather economic diplomacy, I'd call it, and governmental diplomacy with the elected persons that we have throughout the country. We have 9 Quebec offices throughout the United States. We increased the number of staff these last some months, in particular because of the elections, in order to follow what was going on the ground, and in order to be able to help out our Quebec businesses. We also increased the status of our Washington offices. We have more people in all of our offices throughout the United States, and the idea, once again, is to repeat the message that in the follow-up of the elections, Quebec is a choice partner for Americans and for the vast majority of states, in particular in the Northeast, and depending on the sectors, it can include even the West, where I was based before being appointed here to New York. So it's really a ground work with our partners here in the United States. So very quickly in closing, what are people telling you from the various commercial sectors? Are they worried? Well, they're watching closely. Some people have a certain febrility or worriness. People expect the results to be very, very tight, and the results, in fact, won't even be known tomorrow. Now, with our partners, as I mentioned, both commercial, political, we have very good bonds, and we should be able to get through the positive message about our presence here. And then, so thank you very much, Mr. Brulotte. Thank you.
And also thanks there to Catherine Lefranc.
We
want to update you in some numbers. Early numbers are coming in, and I want to source the fact this is coming from CNN. Early results, but take a look at the state of Georgia, because this is, again, one of the 7 key states here. And according to CNN, at this point, based on the votes being counted, Donald Trump is currently leading 55.6% over Kamala Harris at 43.8%. As we take a look right now, this is not Georgia. This is actually the Palm Beach Convention Center, where Republicans are watching the results as they come in. But right now in the key state of Georgia, Donald Trump is leading. In fact, when it comes to the Electoral College votes, he has an early lead at 90 to 27. A few provisos to keep in mind, though. For the in terms of the numbers coming in, the earliest numbers are coming mainly from Republican-leaning states, and also, even much like in the state of Georgia, these are early results. Not all polls have been counted, but just to give you a glimpse of what is happening right now as we monitor the U.S. election. Well, let's continue the discussion on this special night, and joining us in studio right now are Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Robert Fife, Deputy Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press, Mia Rabson, and Ottawa Bureau Chief for LaPresse, Joël-Denis Bellavance. Nice to see the three of you.
Thank you for having us.
So, you know, a lot to talk about, and we're watching this very closely, but I actually want to begin with the news story that was shared here at home today, because Global News was reporting the fact that the Prime Minister has been briefed several times on potential violence in the United States as a result of the election tonight. Bob, how worried are Canadian officials about violence south of the border?
Well, certainly Cabinet and the government was briefed on this, but not in the sense that they have any plans in place to deal with this. Melanie Joly, the Foreign Affairs Minister, said in a scrum earlier today that they've got reassurances from both Democrats and Republicans that the police and national security forces in the United States will be able to handle any kind of violence that they may have. Having said that, there is a great deal of concern that if Trump was to win, how was the Canadian government going to handle him in these kind of aspects? And I think part of the thing is that they've been talking to their other allies to say, look, how can we work together to make sure that he doesn't divide and conquer us, which he has done in the past. So I don't think that there's a real deep concern about this by the government because they have had reassurances. Mm-hmm. But look, let's be honest, they're very concerned about a Trump victory.
Yeah, Mia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the government being briefed on the possibility for violence isn't overly surprising. We saw what happened in the United States 4 years ago. We know that hearing from Americans, I mean, several of the people that I've been talking to in the last couple of weeks, they're incredibly anxious about what's happening. Some of them have been, loading up on toilet paper like it's COVID 2020 all over again. They aren't sure what's going to happen. And so there is a lot of nerves, a lot of anxiety. So it would make sense that there would be a briefing on what we should expect, what it could mean for Canada, particularly. We have a big shared border. And so, it would make sense for Canada to be briefed. I haven't heard any suggestions from Canadians that they're significantly worried about that spilling into Canada or having an immediate effect on Canada.
Joël-Denis, what's your read on it?
Well, it's still interesting that the government would get briefed on that distinct possibility of violence south of the border. I mean, this is supposed to be the world's biggest democracy, an example to the world, and because of what happened on January 6, 4 years ago, it's part of the realm of possibilities that is being presented to Cabinet, and that we have to take it into account. I've talked to some Cabinet ministers privately, and they've expressed some worries, some deep concerns about the possibility that if it is a very tight race, that's no clear winner, not a decisive victory, that maybe not, extreme violence, but some people may see that as an example of the election being stolen again. So that may provoke some reactions from...
But the violence is going to come if Trump wins. He says he's going to get rid of all of these illegal migrants in the United States and deport them. And some people have been living in the United States for decades, and they have their children. That is going to create violence.
And the spillover, because I think that's the other the concern is what happens.
Is going to happen here because a lot of these people are going to try to get into Canada because they don't want to go back to El Salvador or other places like that where the crime rates are very, very bad and the living standards are terrible.
And we saw that happen in 8 years ago after the first Trump presidency, when he did have some crackdown on migrants and immigrants in the United States, illegal residents. We did start to see a surge come across the Canadian border, and that led to problems here. So it's certainly something that Canada has been prepared for and concerned about.
The main road that was used was Chemin Roxham, the Roxham Road. It may become Highway Roxham afterwards with this plan from Mr. Trump to deport illegal immigrants in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is just one potential impact. But Bob mentions it, and I'll bring you in on it in particular because I wonder what challenges will be created with the Trump presidency, but also with the Harris presidency in terms of how Ottawa and Washington will negotiate with each other.
Yeah, I mean, there's risks or challenges regardless of who's there. I think if it's a Harris victory, it's a government that this particular government, the Liberals under Justin Trudeau, are comfortable with. It would be a lot more friendly, a little bit less tense. The relationship between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump wasn't exactly the best relationship he's had with an international leader. But there are definite risks on the trade side regardless. They both have protectionist policies. They're both speaking of a type of Buy America. Renegotiating NAFTA has to happen in 2026. There are big risks for Canada. This government seems to think that they have tried to take the steps to align Canada's economy and make it work so that the United States can't shun Canada and can't do too much because they are too dependent on us. But whether they've actually done that or not, I guess we'll have to see.
I think it was a clever strategy on the part of the government to try to make sure that supply chains were fully and more integrated than ever with the United States. And that if you try to impose protectionist policies, you may disrupt that supply chain that is also key to the U.S. economy. So if you hurt us, you also hurting yourself more. And so that was a policy that was pursued by the Trudeau government after the pandemic, but it was successfully, I think, put into place. And even the ambassador, David Cohen, talked to me about this today, that the supply chain is so integrated today that it's impossible to imagine that it would be dismantled in some way or not.
Yeah, well, over $3 billion a day traded between Canada and the United States.
Yes.
Yeah, and David Cohen was saying how it's the envy of the world, this trade relationship. But, you mentioned Donald Trump. Is there any concern, do you think, about Kamala Harris in terms of negotiating?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, remember, she voted against the renegotiated free trade agreement. You don't hear any American politicians anymore mention the word free trade. They can't get it out of their lips. They're protectionist, highly protectionist now, and the Democratic Party is more protectionist actually than Donald Trump is because they are beholden to the unions. And so this is a really serious threat for Canada because, 70% of our trade goes south of the border. And yes, we are integrated, but if you've got a Congress that is very protectionist and a president who's protectionist, it's going to be rough waters for us, for sure. So we have to figure out other ways to satisfy the Americans. We have to do something about our supply chain. Not supply chains, supply management. The dairy and the eggs and the chickens and all that sort of stuff, which the Americans want that be open.
One of the carrot might be military spending. I think if we have to increase spending to satisfy concerns in the United States.
Yeah. On the Harris front, though, I'd also just add that in terms of the risk, I mean, the softwood lumber dispute, which the Conservatives brought up many, many times today, it is not something that the Harris government, the Biden administration with Harris in the Vice President's office did anything to help Canada. In fact, it got worse in just the last few months. They have not solved that. They've not moved on that. It's a very important thing for Canada, and it's not something we've been able to do.
And
so
it's a generational issue that's never been solved.
Yeah.
But the one thing that we have to be worried about as Canadians too, if it is a Trump presidency, he does not like Justin Trudeau. And he, as you know, he's the kind of guy that wants revenge. So he could do all kinds of really bad things to this country out of spite for Trudeau. He can't stand Trudeau, and that is a big problem for us. Obviously Kamala Harris and Mr. Trudeau get along very, very well, and she's not into that revenge type of politics. But that's a big for me. I think that's a big concern for the country.
Yeah. And the unpredictability as well. You just never. He doesn't always do things thinking about the final consequences,
and
right?
Remember that Mr. Trudeau expressed his satisfaction when Mr. Biden announced that he was running again. And he also condemned openly Mr. Trump after the January 6th event. So I'm sure that Mr. Trump will be remembering those things.
Well, you remember that they were laughing at him, Prince Charles and yes, the French president laughing about him. And so
he's got a long memory.
He does that. Well, which makes me wonder, what are you watching out for this evening? Because, and I said it at the top of this hour, this is a country that is our closest neighbor, our closest ally, our largest trading partner, and as Trudeau the Senior said, when it gets a cold, we sneeze. So what are you watching out for this evening?
Well, look, it's hard to know. We don't know who's going to win. This thing is really, really close to call, and it's very early in the game. It looked over the weekend like she had the momentum to go into this campaign, and he looked like he was faltering. He didn't have as many people at the campaign. He was kind of really off message. But you know, I think Canadians, all the polls show we'd be much happier with Kamala Harris than with Donald Trump, and for very good reason. She's sane, and she's got common sense, and she's pragmatic. With Mr. Trump, you just don't know what you're going to get.
Mm-hmm. Mia?
Well, I think the decisiveness of whoever's victory, whether it comes tonight or not, is one thing I'm looking for. I mean, a decisive victory for either of the candidates could help quiet some of the aftermath that could happen. If it's not a clear winner and it takes days for this to sort out, it could be very bad. It could be bad for the global economy as a result of that. It could be bad for multiple reasons. I think the other thing I'm looking at for is if it's a Trump victory, there are some pretty big international issues that would affect Canada in particular. The war in Ukraine, the United States' support for that war that has been very sort of in lockstep with Canada under the Biden administration is very likely to change. And also what happens in Israel. Those are two huge things that have been having domestic impacts on domestic politics.
Yeah, well, it certainly has been raised that Donald Trump may be more sympathetic to Vladimir Putin than the Biden administration. What happens if we are offside as who we're supporting in that war?
I'll be watching two things. What happens in Pennsylvania? This is going to be a pivotal state for either camps. If Mrs. Kamala Harris loses Pennsylvania, it's over for her. So this is a critical point. She needs to win that state. Secondly, I'll be watching who wins the Congress, the both houses. If, let's say, Mr. Trump wins the presidency, does he have control also of the Congress, which would mean 2 years of no control, no guardrails watching him. So that's going to be even more worrisome. But if the Democrats maintain the House of Representatives, that could use as something to block some of the more controversial measures that Mr. Trump wants to put in place.
Mm-hmm. You know, very quickly, because in the last time around, the first go around, essentially Canada started a charm offensive, and they turned to all the ties in the U.S. to influence negotiations of trade. Do you think that works this time around?
Well, they have to do it. That's their only option we have. And there's reasons for that. To Joël's point with the supply chains, 35 American states are Canada's their biggest trading partner. And that is a very effective message in Congress, and the business community will reflect that as well. And, you know, we did all right out of that free trade agreement that was renegotiated under Mr. Trump. So he may want to make some changes, but he can't say this is a bad deal because he negotiated the deal.
Although you never know.
Yeah.
I mean,
he could. I mean, he is unpredictable. But yes, I mean, I think that the charm offensive, and that's been the whole point, especially if it is a Trump victory, to going around him and sort of having the people who do have his ear and who have influence over him, if there is anyone, that those are the people that Canada's talking to and sort of making that case over and over again. You need us, we need you, let's make this work. The Trump's message throughout this entire campaign has been about the economy. It is the one issue that he probably will listen on and make decisions on. If it isn't bad for the economy, ultimately, it may turn out to be in Canada's favor.
Charm offensive, that has to be slightly different. I would put a lot more emphasis around governors of the states as well, state legislatures, because they can convince the U.S. administration to change their mind, but also not obviously neglecting the key people around Mr. Trump and the eventual Secretary of State he would appoint. So, but that has to be made with either Kamala Harris or Mr. Trump winning.
Okay. Well, we are watching, and of course, we'll keep talking about it. Bob,
thank you.
Joël-Denis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, with that, let's go back to Éric Grenier, who has been watching results come in. The polls analyst, very happy to have you on the program again. Éric, what are you seeing at this point? Because numbers are starting to come in.
Yeah, well, I think the state that we're looking at with the most votes that have been counted among those swing states so far is Georgia. There's over half of the vote that has been counted to date. Right now, Republican Donald Trump has a lead of about 11 points over Kamala Harris in Georgia. That is going to get a lot tighter based on what is yet to come in Atlanta. You're probably still going to be looking at a win for Donald Trump of a few points based on where things are right now. We'll see how that is going to develop as the day goes on, as the night goes on. But what's important about this is that if Donald Trump is going to win Georgia, it does reduce the options for Kamala Harris. It really does mean that she can't give up Michigan or Wisconsin, that she would have to perform well in Arizona and Nevada if one of those states in the Midwest doesn't go her way. So it reduces the map for Kamala Harris. We'll see how much of this vote, as it continues to be counted, where it's going to go. But at the moment, it does look like Donald Trump is in a good position to win Georgia, which, as I said, puts more of an emphasis for Kamala Harris on winning the Midwest, the Rust Belt.
Mm-hmm. So keeping an eye on Georgia. And any other results that's keying your interest right now?
Well, North Carolina is another one. This one does look like it is very close, and it's hard to see where it's going to go from here. North Carolina would have been one of the other states that Kamala Harris would have hoped that if it went her way, it would free up her options, give her more of a path to getting to the White House. It is still really tight. It still does look like it's going to come to those Midwestern states. So a Southeast option, a Southern option for Kamala Harris might not be in the cards, which means that she'll have to look elsewhere.
Okay, we are watching, Eric, early results, but good to have them with you, and we'll speak again before this hour is through. Polls analyst Éric Grenier, the man behind the writ. Well, we are now very happy to welcome to the program David Wilkins. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to Canada from 2005 to 2009 under George W. Bush. Ambassador Wilkins, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be with you, and good to see that beautiful Canadian flag flying before we got on there.
Well, as I said to you off air, we love the red and the white. Listen, I want to begin with your impressions of this campaign. Are you surprised that the race remains as close as it is?
Well, it's been that way for the last month, and so no, I'm not surprised. It's certainly going in, it's the tightest one I've seen in my lifetime. To have an NBC poll yesterday on Sunday saying it was 49-49 popular vote, a virtual tie that way. The last two races that Donald Trump has won, he's been behind in the popular vote considerably and lost them both times. So it's going to come down to a handful of states, maybe as few as 50,000 votes separating the winners in those states, and it's going to be close. You're looking at probably 7 states that are going to decide this thing either tonight or tomorrow or the next few days.
Yeah, well, we are ready for a long night if need be. But, as Canadians, we do watch U.S. politics very closely. And I think it's fair to say that many are wondering how the vote tonight might affect cross-border trade, because Mr. Trump has been talking about tariffs. Kamala Harris, Senator, she did not vote in favor of CUSMA. Should Canadians be concerned right now about trade post this campaign?
Well, we as you know, we have the greatest trade relationship the world's ever known, so we all should be concerned about trade. We're your biggest customer, will continue to be, but sure, the U.S. has become more protectionist over the last few years. Used to be Democratic Party was more for tariffs, more protectionist, more protecting the labor unions and that sort of thing. But the Republican Party has, in the last few years, have joined them at the table as being protectionist. So you've got, regardless who wins, you've got that issue that you've got to deal with. Are there going to be more tariffs? Is it going to be more protectionist measures, more Buy in America clauses inserted in appropriation bills? I mean, that's something Canada always has to be aware of and concerned about.
Mm-hmm. And another matter that, of course, our two countries work closely on together is security. And Canada has set a target year to meet the 2% NATO commitment. I'm wondering, given that Donald Trump, for example, in the first time he was president, talked very much about NATO and other countries stepping up, will Canada have to revisit that target date of 2%, whoever wins this presidential vote?
Well, I think it's good strategy if Canada does meet that commitment, the commitment of 2%. The GDP. I think the commitment, the expenditure level right now by Canada is about 1.3 or 1.4. They need to meet it or exceed it and do their part. And it's good strategy in that. In my experience, when I've worked for George W. Bush, the more Canada was involved on the international level as a partner with the U.S., the more effective Canada could be in getting things done on a bilateral basis. You saw that by the great effort Canadians made in Afghanistan and the reciprocal effort of George W. Bush wanting to help Harper when he got elected. And 2 months later, we signed a softwood lumber agreement that stayed in place for 9 years.
So to step up would help right across the board, you would think, and step up quicker than the timeline set out right now?
Well, I think the more you can do, the better. And I think either party, either president is going to demand Canada do its part. I think Trump's been much more vocal about it, in the past. And so I think, again, it's strategic that Canada does that on an international scale and can be more effective on bilateral issues.
In terms of personal relationship, though, you know, for example, Justin Trudeau, Donald Trump, they had a bit of an up and down relationship the last time Trump was in presidency. Kamala Harris has not spent a lot of time with Justin Trudeau. What should Canadian officials be prepared for, whoever should win this vote?
Well, you just got to work on those relationships. You know, two points. One is the U.S.-Canada relationship is bigger than just the president and the prime minister. It's all the elected officials, the provincial officials, the state officials, the businesses that go across the border every day. So it's gonna prevail and it's gonna be strong. But I do think a strong relationship among the two top leaders make a difference. You've seen that. You saw that with Reagan and Mulroney. You saw that with Chrétien and Clinton. You certainly saw that with George W. Bush and Harper. So you know, I understand Canada most likely will have an election in next year. And so you may or may not have a new leader, but whoever that leader is, it would be to all our benefit if the two leaders could work well together.
Ambassador Wilkins, really appreciate you taking the time this evening to speak with us. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Michael. Good talking to you.
And you. Okay, let's take a look at some of the results that we're getting right now. And I'm going to quote right now the Associated Press in the United States, because according to the AP, at this point, Harris has won Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey. Donald Trump has won Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. And in terms of where that leaves us in Electoral College vote, at this point, Trump is leading the Electoral College 101 votes to 71 for Kamala Harris. Still, these are early results, even when we talked about Georgia. At this point, Donald Trump is leading in Georgia, but we're still waiting for counts in the larger city centers like Atlanta, which have leaned more Democratic. So this will be a long night as we take a look at these numbers. But again, those latest numbers coming to us from the Associated Press, Donald Trump leading the Electoral College as of 8:46 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as we said earlier, there is some concern that tonight's vote could spark violence in the United States. Latendresse is the White House correspondent for TVA LCN, and earlier he did speak with Catherine LaFrance about how he has never seen a campaign as electric and emotionally charged as this one.
Bonsoir, Richard. Merci d'être là.
Good evening, Sean. Thank you for being here. My pleasure. Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. So you're in Florida right now. How's it going? What's the mood in Florida today? In Florida, generally speaking, we saw over time in our meetings with people here, the state has moved over to the Republicans. It's not so long ago that it was one of the pivot states, remember, in 2000 by some 500 votes. George W. Bush won over Al Gore. But now the state has gone full Republican. So I think that there's less tension than I see usually in Washington or in other key states. People here are simply on Trump's side, and that's the general mood and feeling. So you were in the city of Washington not so long ago, yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. So how was it in Washington? Because we know that the city is in semi-lockdown, and there's a lot of stores that have even boarded up. What was the mood there? Well, there's more fences put up around the Capitol, around the residence of the Vice President, the Naval Observatory. That's the specific place where the Vice President resides. They want to increase the security. So this contributes to raise the tension. Now, Washington is a very Democratic city. 94% of the vote will be Democratic. So when people feel that Donald Trump's fans might be very unhappy if they lose the election, they're being very careful. Personally, I have the feeling that after what we saw in the 6th of January 2021, the Capitol was attacked by Donald Trump's people, all of the police services, and there's quite a number of them here in the federal system here, the Secret Service, the Capitol Police, etc., All of these services are ready. They're ready for the worst. And in the American capital, Washington, even if there are some businesses that have boarded up, I do not expect things to go south like we saw in January 2021. However, it remains possible. It can go either way. So it could be people that are unsatisfied with the defeat of Donald Trump, in particular if he stokes the flames. But if he wins the election, some supporters of Kamala Harris that are further to the left might decide to express their discontent with violence. So let's come back to the election and the campaign. You've covered a lot of campaigns. You live in the United States. You've been covering it for a long time. So is it compared to others that you've covered in the past, Alicia? Well, as a campaign, Catherine, it's quite different. And for several reasons. First of all, we have a candidate that was declared a felon by the courts. It's never seen that. Donald Trump is in a funny situation. So Donald Trump also says some pretty weird things, and I say that very objectively. And that's all he's done throughout the campaign. He's showing himself more bitter, more unhappy about the way that American society is moving. And this did nothing to give any hope to Americans that things could improve if he wins or loses. The other fundamental aspect is that we have a candidate opposite him who 3 months ago was not the candidate and who 4 months ago was an ordinary vice president and 4 years ago was a candidate for the presidency for the party's designation of the presidency was rejected. So now it's sort of funny that Kamala Harris appears as the woman who can save American democracy when not so long ago she wasn't even in the picture. So this is quite a different election, and you're quite right about that. I have been following them for quite some years, 2004 to be precise, between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And this one is very particular because, once again, everything went completely different right in the middle of the campaign when Joe Biden withdrew from seeking the Democratic leadership, and Kamala Harris replaced them, and everything started changing then with a very good debate that she delivered against Donald Trump. And during that debate, we saw to what extent Donald Trump remains the candidate who is undisciplined. He is completely disorganized with his campaign people. They're very experienced, but he is very difficult to pin down. And he's 2 days of good measures and then 2 days of silliness. And that's been the results of the race up to now. So, Richard, thank you very much for having answered our questions. My pleasure, Catherine. To see you again.
Et merci, Catherine Lafrance, for that. Well, we are now approaching the top of the clock, and we will be joining C-SPAN special coverage in just a few minutes' time. But before we get there, let's bring back some of our guests right now. Polls analyst Éric Grenier, Washington Bureau Chief for the Christian Science Monitor, Linda Feldmann, and veteran Washington journalist David Levinthal. Hello to the three of you. You know, I'll begin with you here, Éric, to walk us through some of the numbers that are emerging right now.
Yeah, I've been just keeping an eye on the results as they're starting to be counted. The 2 states I've been keeping an eye on, especially now, are Pennsylvania and Michigan. It's still really early in those counts, and especially in the case of Pennsylvania, it could take a very long time before we get anywhere close to a result. Right now, in terms of the count, Kamala Harris is well ahead in Pennsylvania and in Michigan, but it's because a lot of the vote is coming in from areas that are friendly to the Democratic candidate. It does look like, based on what we're seeing so far, that these are going to be very close states and ones to watch for the rest of the night and into the early morning. So it's still really an election that is way too early and way too close to call, but it does look like those states that we thought were going to be the ones that would be the tipping point states that would decide who gets to become the president, very likely that they will end up being those states that we're going to be talking about for the next few hours.
Yeah, and again, when we were talking about it going into tonight, states that were very close within the margin of errors. You say early, but still too early to kind of come out with any trend line other than the fact this is going to take some time, Éric?
I think the easiest thing we can say right now is that there's no real indication that we know how the night's going to be. There have been elections in the past when those early numbers come in, you start to see that there's a trend building, that one candidate is clearly outperforming perhaps the polls. We're not really seeing that. We're seeing Kamala Harris doing better in some parts of the country, Donald Trump doing better in other parts. So it's really too difficult to say where it's going. So what we can say is that it is probably going to be a long night.
Okay, a long night, which David Levinthal was talking about earlier on, as we bring him and Linda Feldmann to the conversation as well. So as I have the three of you here, I have about 5 minutes left, and I want to go around the table. And Linda, I'll get you to start us off here as to what you'll be watching out for as this night goes on.
I'm watching those 3 states, particularly Pennsylvania. It could really all boil down to Pennsylvania. And it's one of those states that's just really split down the middle. And it's the most important state because it has the most electoral votes. You know, the urban areas are Democratic. The suburban area and rural is Republican, pro-Trump. It's the suburban areas that are really critical. And you, in particular, the collar counties around Philadelphia, where we're looking in particular at Republican women who might choose to vote for Kamala Harris because of abortion rights. I know I'm becoming Johnny One Note here, but I will also note, just changing to a different state quickly, that in Florida, the state amendment to protect abortion rights has lost. It needed to get to 60%, and it got 58%. So that is bad news for women's rights in a very important state.
Okay, good to know that development. David, what are you watching out for then as this night goes on?
One thing I'm watching out for is actually not presidential race related, well, very indirectly, but the U.S. House races that are taking place and all the talk that we're having with the presidential election and Joe Biden in dropping out and Kamala Harris getting in and in Donald Trump running again. It is very lost on many Americans that the U.S. House of Representatives is also incredibly, incredibly close. And were Donald Trump to become the president of the United States again, Democrats are almost certainly going to have to win the U.S. House in order to have a check on his power, because it's unlikely that the U.S. Senate is going to be retained by Democrats. Conversely, Republicans, if Kamala Harris is to win the presidency, Democrats win the U.S. House, they're going to need the Senate, and they're going to have to absolutely control that. So those lower ballot races, they don't get talked about nearly as much as they probably should, given the gravity of the decisions that are being made there. But that's going to play a huge, huge role in subplot in what ultimately happens in 2025 when we have a new government in the United States.
Okay, Eric, last word to you. What are you watching out for?
Well, just to bring a little bit of a Canadian perspective on looking at the results, we've seen in some of our elections just this fall that there is an increasing rural-urban divide in our politics. And obviously, this has been a thing that's been a feature of or a bug of American politics for a while. Are we going to see that get even starker? Are we going to see Trump's numbers even higher in the rural areas, the Democrats doing even better in urban areas? And are we going to see some of these states start to continue to move in one direction? Florida was supposed to be a little bit more competitive, not really a swing state, but a little bit more competitive than what we've seen in the results so far. So are we going to see that some of those swing states that used to be swing states that are voting Republican now, are they going to become more Republican? And those former swing states like Virginia that used to be swing states, are they going to be voting more for the Democrats than in the past? Is the country going to get even more divided in those states that used to be toss-ups? And I think that'll be also a pretty decisive factor in determining who's going to end up winning this election.
Well, without a doubt, a lot of interesting points to be watching out for as we continue the coverage. But for now, Éric Grenier, Linda Feldmann, David Levinthal, thank you for being with us this evening. We'll chat again in the days to come, but thank you for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
And I'm Michael Serapio. Thank you for joining us here on our special coverage on CPAC. And we want to show you a couple of images now. Again, keeping an eye at Howard University in Washington, D.C. This is where a watch party is taking place with the Democratic campaign, where we are expecting to hear from Kamala Harris a little later this evening. And from Washington, one more look at Palm Beach, Florida, because Palm Beach, Florida, the convention center, is where Republicans are staging their watch party, where Donald Trump may speak from tonight. Still no word from the Republican Party whether it will be here at the convention center or whether it will be at Mar-a-Lago. Donald Trump's resort in Palm Beach in the state of Florida. Now, our CPAC coverage with our more uniquely Canadian angle is wrapping up, but we are going to join our friends now at C-SPAN for their Election Night 2024. You can see it right there on your screen. We're going to join their program already in progress in about 15 seconds time. But as I do wrap up this hour, again, a very special thank you for everyone here at CPAC for joining us. It's been our pleasure to be a part of this special night for you. We'll have continuing coverage on CPAC in the days to come on the U.S. vote. But for now, let us join C-SPAN and their U.S. decision coverage.